Welcome back, everyone, to another episode on Living Your Greatness. And I'm super pumped before introducing a returning guest, someone who supported me in the early stages. His name is Peter Grandich. And before I go on about Peter, because I could literally write a book on all the things I admire about him, but I want to start off by just saying this is a limited edition series on building generational wealth. And I really feel the call currently right now to support not only my generation of millennials, but even above me, whether you're a baby boomer or even below me, whether you are a Gen Z. I really feel the call to provide more financial literacy and education to people. So, without further ado, I want to just give a quick welcome back here to Peter Grandich. Good to see you, Peter.
Good to be back with you.
Good to have you back, Peter. It was also good to catch up and kind of hear how you were doing, but most importantly, also have some real talk about people that we really admire in our lives. We were speaking about Michael Gentile as well as Danielle Camboni, who will also be part of this series. But most importantly, Peter, I want to talk about you right now. I want to, for my audience that doesn't know you, because it has been a while, if you could share us a little bit about, your story of, building generational wealth, but more importantly, like even your other story about becoming the whiz kid.
Well, it's a 40-something year story in the making. Hopefully has a few more chapters left, but without any formal education or training, I didn't even finish high school. I came in the financial world only because as a warehouse manager, I had turned a small sum of money into a fairly large sum of money, only to lose it through what was called back in the 80s penny stockbrokers. And I started an investment club, was discovered by a gentleman that owned a small brokerage firm. And despite everything my wife and father-in-law had to say against it, I became back what we call back then a stockbroker. Hard to imagine for younger people, but there were no computers, there were no cell phones. You were given a desk, a pad, and a pen, and a computer in front of you. And good luck was basically what it was. And I wanted out right away because I couldn't cold call that. Two people hung up, I was done. And so, really, that was the mainstay of how to develop business, other than the gentleman who started me in the business, who wrote a very popular newsletter at the time. It was gold oriented, but it was popular. Said that I was analytical and I should put my ideas in a newsletter. And that's how the Grandich letter was born. And fast forward, before long, I got myself onto some national networks. Before there was CNBC, there was a network called Financial News Network. I got myself on there. I was working for a New York Stock Exchange member firm at the time. Their head of investment strategy quit. I was going on this TV show and getting hundreds of leads. So they promoted me in early 1987 to head of investment strategy. I wasn't even in the business 3 years. And I made a forecast of a crash. It wasn't the forecast of the crash that got them interested. It was the fact that they wanted me to retract it or resign, which I failed to do. And within 6 weeks, there was the famous 87 crash. And then just happened on the next day, I made a forecast that the market within 2 years would be back at its all-time high. And the Wall Street Whiz Kid name was born. The moniker came from appearing on Good Morning America, where they featured a story about me up to that point. I started to become a living legend in my own mind. I believed a lot of the press that I was getting. I went international, spoke at conferences, and in 1995, thought I had reached the American dream, worth several $1 millions, big home, big car, race horses, race cars, and then took up a terrible male addiction called golf. And in my top of my arrogance, thinking that I would just trade, I actually left the brokerage business and just went out as a consultant. I probably played golf 4 or 5 days in a row and was going out again. And the wife said to me, "Are you playing golf again today?" And I said, "I plan on playing golf every day for the rest of my life." Well, by the end of the millennium, I would lose most of that wealth that I had gained. And I suffered the first of three debilitating uh, depressions. This one started with a panic attack, which mimicked the heart attack, and then found myself in the new millennium basically starting over. But two things happened. One, I met a man that would influence my life more than any other in terms of faith, but I would also meet a man who would basically blow up everything I had been taught up to and been led to believe on how finances were done. And I would go to work for him, and that would start to change my life. I would get involved with professional athletes in early 2001 to the point where I would start a separate business for Christian based professional athletes. And then I returned back to the metals and mining industry after a few years' absence, only to in 2008 suffer a horrible depression again. But then this time there was none of the attributes that are normally causes of depression. There was no money loss, there was no love loss, there was no health issue. I literally was here one day and down here the next. But what that came for, of course, hindsight being 2020, was I still, while I was going through a change, faith was becoming part of my everyday life. But I was still living a little bit of the old Petey, as we used to say. And that second depression really washed that out. And then things just got bigger and better. And I would actually be a regular in the metals and mining. But in 2013, felt that I was led more to talk about my faith and finance and deal with athletes. So I left the metals and mining industry until Daniela Camboni, ironically, would reach out to me in 2018, 19, learned that I had written a book, heard what transpired, went back up to Wall Street to be interviewed by her, got a little involved in the metals and mining industry. And then in 2022, but just before that, maybe a year and a half before, I would meet Michael Gentili. And as I told you before we started, there's only two people I can say this about in my 40-year career, and I'm not one of them. The most honest and most intelligent people in finance, one is Michael Gentili, and two is that mentor I told you back that started back in 2000 named Frank Congelosi. And we would develop the relationship. And then in 2022, again, without any typical reasons, but this would be the third and worst of the depressions. I actually lost the will to live. And it's hard to sit here, by the way, to imagine that why would I want to die at that point? But that's really what it came to. And all of them, now looking back, really occurred because I believed I was moving away from the central part of what God had me blessed with and life with. And so I, at this point in time, as you and I speak, despite it sometimes causing hardship and literally attacks from the enemy, I wear my faith on my sleeve and in my business. I moved away from dealing with the athletes, because of what happened in sports and social and political stuff becoming forefront in sports, except maybe in hockey. And so I left the athlete business, and now, as you and I speak, what's left is I comment on X, I have a blog, I do interviews, and I try wherever possible, recognizing that it's not my job, or nor do people want to hear me beat my chest on why if you don't know Christ you're going to die or something of that nature that some fundamental Christians like to promote. But I am a living testament to not having to be some brilliant Einstein person and still be okay and do okay in the world of finance. And obviously, that's one of the reasons why I know you reach out, because you've been called, and I've watched your work since you first interviewed me. And I think it's admirable that someone wants to do what you're doing, because one of the things that changed in the 40 years, people are not devoting any real time to finances in the same manner that they do legal or health reasons. Yet finance ends up being the single biggest decision why people get divorced, impacts people's health, and yet they don't give it the time it's really deserving. So I commend you for that, and why I'm so eager and willing to come on and talk to you again.
I appreciate those kind words, Peter. And I also want to acknowledge you've always been someone since I first met you. It takes great courage to speak your truth, whether that's saying out loud things that maybe people disagree with you, whether it's things you believe in the financial world. I actually think that is pure honesty. And I love that about you. I think we need more Peter Granges out there that are speaking their truth and truly trying to not promise, but educate make people more financially literate, which is what I was talking about before. You provided your story, and also knowing, I want you to know that like your story matters. I hear you, I see you, and I also want people to be able to learn, from some of the things that you've learned over your 40 years of yourself, because we always learn more about ourselves as we age. And whether that's not only in financial wealth, but even emotional wealth or physical wealth, everything's interconnected and is so important, right? Um, so this makes me actually want to shift to Peter. If we think about the big picture of, like this theme and this topic of, building generational wealth, I'm curious to ask you, like, what does generational wealth mean to you? And why do you feel as well that this is so important for more people to understand?
So when we hear people say wealth, most people right away think of money. They see a picture of money at a certain level. To
Hmm.
me, it's gone way beyond that because of what I transpired. I'll start with one of the big misconceptions of people, and it's been driven by what Wall Street and Madison Avenue has done for decades, if not 100 or more years, knowingly or unknowingly conspiring to create an atmosphere that more money equals more happiness. In fact, basically, that's the theme of all the financial service ads when you see it. Come with us. We have the right tools or whatever, and or whatever you're looking to do, retirement, children, whatever, the commercial always ends in a beautiful scene that we all imagine that we want to live to. But the big misconception of that in the real life, at least in the real life that's been for me, is they would want you to think that the guy that owns the bus company is always happier than the guy driving the bus. But when you find real happiness, many times it's from people with far less means than very well to do, wealthy people. So I think the first concept is wealth has to be more than money. One of the great biblical misconceptions of people that aren't biblical oriented, but they've heard it and they'll say it and misquote it. And they say, yeah, money's the root of all evil. Well, it actually says the love of money is the root of all evil. There were people in biblical times, including that followed Jesus and that Jesus showed that he loved, that were very wealthy. But he greatly warns, and in the Old Testament and in Judaism as well, as there's great warnings about falling in love with money and thinking money is going to be the answer. And the last part of this, which is very important, I think, is in this book. Now, you can either view the book as I do, as spiritually and led and a manual from God, or it can just be an historical book that you can think just a bunch of people got together and put together and wrote. But there's no denying the influence it's had for centuries. And what's real interesting about it is there's more topics on it versus about matters of money and things related to money than what you would think would be the ultimate two topics, heaven or hell. And even half the parables that Jesus gave out are related to that. And the one thing in that book that you can't find a positive verse on is debt. And if you ask me what is the single biggest issue about building wealth, it's the opposite, and that people take on debt and use debt in a wrong way that leads to a lot of negativities. And that is where the world has gone. Go 2 generations back, go to my grandparents or even my parents. They didn't even have credit cards, so there wasn't even a chance to run the credit cards of it. They couldn't afford it. Yeah, there were a few things you could make payments on, but we've become a generation of too much debt and too much stuff. And how we know we have too much stuff and it's in Canada and the US, you don't have to go that many miles down a major road without seeing a public storage facility. Now, they've done nothing wrong. They run an honorable, good business, but I view them as the poster child for what's wrong. Because when I was a young kid, we didn't have public storage. Our dwellings were much smaller. We had far fewer things. And yet, every medical psychiatric study now says we're more of a mess now than any other time before. And so, wealth, when you talk about generational wealth and all, think of something more than about money. Think about all the things that really is the foundation to life and a good life. And what you'll find is that some of the happiest people you'll ever meet are people with the least amount of what we would call huge wealth. And I can tell you, having actually dealt with a couple very wealthy people that were in the Fortune 400 and some of the athletes I once dealt with who were really in a world of their own, they were able to do something that not even 1/10 of 1% men could achieve, and they'd be paid so handsomely for it. Yet they treated wealth not in the way as the gift that they should have. So, how you also handle it, if you're blessed with it, is also critical.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer, Peter, because it makes me even think like I really think and I'm also in alignment where some of the wealthiest minds, not necessarily in terms of financial wealth, are they the wealthiest, but in terms of just like their mindset. And I think that's what you were getting at is like having that wealthy mindset rather than a poor mindset, and kind of understanding that again, money doesn't mean success or doesn't mean happiness, right? So you were alluding to that, which I appreciate. And I also want to kind of stay there because some people could be, let's say, very rich financially in terms of like making a lot of income, but then kind of what you were speaking about, they could be really poor at managing their money or even mindset wise. I'm sure there's stories that you heard of, even in like the the sports world of like some of these athletes making a lot of money, yet they don't know how to manage their wealth. So something that I want to go with, and feel free in any way possible to kind of move the way that you want to go, but whether it is someone that's tuning in right now that's currently like, hey, Peter, I'm already in debt, I'm trying to shift my mindset, or whether it is maybe, a story that you've heard of in the past of like a athlete that already had the rich amount of money, but maybe didn't have the mindset of knowing how to manage their wealth. Do you have any stories that you want to share?
Well, if you had about 200 hours, we can get into some of them. But I'll say a couple of things. First, I'm
Okay.
still very involved in a planning group, and this is right on the top of our list.
Okay.
It's hard for most Americans. I don't deal with Canadians, but I'm assuming that they fall into a similar category.
Hmm.
Still find 7 to 8 out of 10 families, no matter whether working class all the way up to very wealthy, spending more than they make. It's just become a way of life.
Hmm.
And that leads to nothing but issues. Uh, in terms of athletes, one of the great stories that I remember, I spent 13 years working with the New York Giants players and coaches during the season, actively doing Bible study, uh, chapel, and fellowshipping, and even traveling to do the Philadelphia and Washington game. And so I got to know a lot of the young guys. And of course, I got to the point where I was old enough to be their grandfather. But during that time frame, I witnessed, I thought, one of the most uniqueness, and I used always as an example of how it messed up folks can get around money. There was one athlete, I cannot name them, but he was very well off. He signed very huge contract. And so he bought a very huge home in a very wealthy area, not too far from where the stadium is here in New Jersey. He had an extremely expensive, well-known car, one of the real type of cars, and he wore lots of jewelry around his neck. And then there was a young man, I think he was a late draft pick, or he might have even been a free agent, signed basically the minimum contract, but they hung together. And that young man rented a home near him so he can live like him, leased a car like he was driving, which was paying through the nose, and wore a lot of the same jewelry so they could look alike and act alike. But the difference really showed up, and this is before contracts became guaranteed in the NFL. That young man blew his knee and never got to play again. And he went from, being able to make hundreds of thousands of dollars to struggling to make, a workman's paycheck. And so my partner, who was that started, was a former Giant running back. He used to say, and now of course it changed because contracts are guaranteed, but he used to say the NFL stands are not for long. And so that example again is that wealth can be fleeting.
Hmm.
You can have some of it, and whatever happens tomorrow is a concern. I think the other story that I like to tell only happened several weeks ago. we live in a fairly affluent county here in New Jersey, and we drove to this is my partner and I, to a very exclusive town within this community, huge home, 6,000 square feet, four or five late modeled luxury cars parked in. And it was a husband and wife probably earning four or five, maybe even 600,000 combined income, with two grown young men still living at home, early 20s probably. And to make the long story short, after sitting down with them in a very ritzy home, they were several $1,000s a month spending more than they were making. And they were looking for ways on how to do better. And even though they were playing the stock market and everything, they realized they weren't getting ahead, and they were starting to get to, they started that kids were grown and they didn't have much saved, et cetera, et cetera. And in a very long story short, basically we saw that they were about somewhere between $2,000 to $3,000 a month spending more than they were making. So I came up with a very easy solution, but it was a solution that 7 or 8 out of 10 people could not accept. But I was shocked who was the person who ended up not accepting it. And I literally said, with all four sitting there, I saw a bunch of luxury cars out there, and I know they're either being payments made or leases. If we drop them down to maybe an Impala or something, and you're a brand new one too, and all, get you to where you got to go from and all, we can clearly get you to be cash flow positive. And expecting there to be the two young guys to come out because, they have these fancy cars to impress the girls or what have you. It's the wife that basically flipped out. And she said something that I said 25 years ago when I had to give up the first big home and big car and all the stuff that I had. And she said, what are my neighbors or friends going to think? I can't show up in an Impala or whatever car I suggested. And that's when you know that you have an issue, because you're finding your joy in life through things and images versus the realities. And I'm not saying you have to be a lover of God or whatever the case may be, but when your heart is not at peace and it's always concerned about keeping this going and all, eventually something happens. And what normally happens is your health turns bad. And then a lot of the money you spent to get to this point, you end up spending trying to get your health back. I see that now, particularly I live in a 55 and over community and all. And I see a lot of cases where people have been living above their means. And now that they've gotten ill, they have a problem. I'll tell you the single biggest problem in the US now, and I don't know if it applies in Canada. When I had seniors come in for planning, they never came in with mortgage debt. Now they're coming in with mortgage debt. Part of it because of how they live, but also trying to help children and all. They've incurred debt and all. Debt is the biggest enemy to wealth. It is. It is just. It is. It's a facade. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to have a home, and if you can get it reasonably priced and have a mortgage. But people don't even understand when they pay back that mortgage over time how much more they actually pay for the house, et cetera. So I think just realistically, to trying to give a ballpark thing, is wealth is not everything it's cracked up to be. Because if it was, you wouldn't see story after story of people well means, turning to drugs and other things and taking their own lives and all despite having what the world would tell you is everything that you need to or should try to get in life.
Yeah, no, I totally respect that answer, Peter. And I feel, what you were trying to get at was, in some of these situations, people need to learn better to live below their means, right? Because it's these bad habits that compound over time. And that even if you have, right, richness in terms of, your salary, it could turn the other way very quickly, which is what you got at, and you used a great example. And that's why I think it's so important, like even like this conversation that we're having. I just feel, okay, it is a challenging time right now if we look big picture in the world with, even government debt, in terms of leaders that should be, leading, whether it's Canada or whether it's United States a little bit better. There's obviously some issues there. And we also don't want to make sure in terms of our own personal sovereignty, we don't want to be following that, right? We want to be controlling our money so we could control our health and our wealth, right? And I really feel that, there's a big concern, for people that are not trying to educate themselves or believe that they have the mindset or they have the ability to reframe, what's going on with their finances to protect themselves. And I also want to add too, I think it's beyond again, and I love that you ended with this, it's beyond the financial wealth category. I think when I think about in the last 5 to 10 years of time that I've invested in myself, it's been my social wealth, it's been my financial wealth, it's been my fiscal wealth, Peter. If I showed you a photo from 8 years ago where I was starting to get some uh, poor drinking habits, and I showed you where I am today, you'd be shocked. So I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but I think it is important. All these principles here are kind of interconnected. And that makes me lead, you talked about the aspect of debt, right? And I'm curious to hear how would you walk someone that they're like, hey, Peter, I have debt. I want to invest. I'm learning about, financial education, but the thing is you can't invest unless you have money saved. So what would you recommend? Because I get this often sometimes from people that have been following my show or people that are kind of curious. Hey, when you first started your show, gold was, let's say at kind of $1,700 and now it's over, 3,400. And most of the time, right away, Peter, this is what I say, but I would love to hear your opinion. I first tell them, like, forget about even gold right now. First, think about how do you learn about financial education? How do you learn about, if you have debt, first getting out of that. So I'm speaking a little bit too much here, but I'd love to hear what would you do if someone approached you and asked you these questions where really their responsibility is to take care of their debt first.
Yeah. So first, let me say, kind of connecting what we just discussed into what you just asked is every generation other than boomers, so
Hmm.
the ones that are coming after boomers,
Hmm.
are going to pay an extra price because how boomers lived.
Mm.
So governments, remember, don't manufacture anything. They live off of what they're able to collect through taxes and revenues from people and then hopefully provide services that make life affordable and all. The younger than boomers are going to have more of a burden on them percentage wise in the life to come because of how much debt has been occurred
Mhm.
and what it's going to mean in terms of even to try to give similar lifestyles. So the first thing is to be prepared that you're going to be more burdensome than I was.
Mhm.
I think that's a clear definite. I think it just goes back to, like you said. So when you have debt, like I meet people, give me an example, not too long ago, came in and because of bad credit, their debt is between 18 and 23%, the credit cards are charging them. And
Mm.
so they're asking me, gee, I keep hearing you talk about gold. I like to buy it. But and I said, no, you can make 18 to 23% right now. And they go, how's that? Pay off this debt.
Mm.
It's the same as if you made it, and it's only going to compound and all. So I think the first order is become cash flow positive.
Mm.
In our planning group, our planning is not based on chasing net worth. Our planning group is to be as efficient as effective with cash flow. There's two things I like to teach young folks to learn and appreciate. I call it my financial planning 101. There's two things that if you could be successful at, you'll be on your road to being a better financial person. The first one is called an LOC. When you ask people if you have $20 and you lost it, what you lose, they give you the right answer, $20. But in fact, the actual right answer is not only did you lose the 20, but what the 20 could have made if you didn't lose it in the first place.
Mm.
And so when we sit down with people, a lot of people have what's called LOCs, which stands for lost opportunity cost. Now, accountants know about that. The more complicated, or if you're a business person, the more LOCs you have. We find them. And many times people have them because they have different people that may be helping them, but no one's ever quarterbacked and put everybody in the room. They may have a financial advisor, a lawyer, an accountant, an insurance person, a real estate person, And many times, some of those things that each one's doing, supposedly in the best interest of them, is actually taken away from somebody else. So the first thing is to make sure you capture all your LOCs and put them on the right side of the ledger. Money adds up quickly if you can stop it from going out the door unnecessarily. The other is, and this is a trick, and it's not easy to show, it's something you have to demonstrate, but there is an example out there that does it the best, and that's a bank. See, a bank doesn't manufacture anything, really doesn't provide any special service to you other than you come in, and these days you don't even come in anymore. Everybody does everything online, but you deposit a sum of money and they give you one return on it. They pay you an interest, and whatever it is, that's what you get. But while that money sits with them, they sometimes lend it up as many as two, three, or even four times while you still sit with it. And so they've learned to make your dollar do the work of two, three, or $4. That's called velocity of money. The longer money can grow without being taxed or misspent or handled wrongly, the faster it can go. And a lot of times, again, the combinations of LOCs and velocity of money can make a difference in people. So those are the first two things. And of course, spending less than you make. Once you have those things grounded and hopefully you have paid off or lessening your debt, then you can look at the investment world and things of that nature. Just remember this, and this is hard, and it took me losing a lot of money not once or twice to conclude to this. The only thing those of us who look like we're able to look into a crystal ball and predict the future, in the end, we all become experts in only one thing: how to eat a lot of broken glass. No one knows the future, and no one's going to be right or right a lot. The only thing I would tell you, Ben, after 40 something years versus someone that may be hearing investments for the first time, I probably can make a better educated guess than them right now, but it's only a guess. And one of the things that I found now at the towards the end of my career is that people's willingness to take chances on too risky of given what they should be has become a way of life for folks.
Hmm.
And Wall Street created a word so it never had to say the true word. The true word is gambling. So they came up with a word called speculating. And so speculating sounds a lot better. Well, Mrs. Jones, I think if you speculate on this, that, or the other, you have a chance to make a lot of money. That sounds a whole lot better than saying, well, Mrs. Jones, if you were willing to gamble, because right away, when people hear gamble, they think there's a chance of losing. But when we hear speculating, we don't think of losing. And you have to be mentally and financially prepared. And if I can give one thing, financial service industry is terrible at. There are really good planners out there that think financially right, correct, but very few, and I think only because I went through it myself, can begin to understand mental anguish. So when things don't work out and you lose and it impacts your everyday life, far worse than the financial and just the mental aspect of it all, I think you have to be prepared. That's why I always like to say you have to be mentally and financially prepared to lose part of all your capital. And people go, yeah, yeah, I am. And as soon as they start to lose, they prove that they weren't to begin with. And I think that's very, very important that you have to be prepared and have plan Bs and Cs. Most people go into a conference or watch on a show, they've already spent the money in their head if they only buy the stock or do what the person said and had no plan whatsoever in case it went the other way. And that's why I believe you have to have something more than a plan A.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that answer, Peter. And I want to add a little sport analogy here, but I think I've shared with you before. I used to be a very high level athlete. I played water polo, played for Team Quebec, and then I was trained with Team Canada until I got injured. But I was always really, really big as an athlete that defense before offense. I really think some of the best teams that obviously you need to be offensive, but it takes a lot of patience and strategy to, defend your own net. And if you could get scored less on, you just have to take that little bit of effort now to go offense and score and attack. And so, before anyone even thinks about investing, right, they gotta again save. And I think that takes a lot of defense. And I like how you talked about all those little kind of like increments of how we could, protect and compound our kind of current money or wealth. Is so important. And I also love too that you spoke about speculation and compared it as gambling, because it totally is. And I do feel, unfortunately, because of maybe, and again, I don't want to speak for sure in every case, but maybe because of miseducation or understanding, there's a lot of people that just say, "Oh, that guy is a millionaire. He must have did this. I'm going to copy for the instant gratification." And next thing you know, they're getting hurt, right? So that's kind of like the next thing I want to go at is, we talked about, okay, debt. First thing we need to do is save. The next thing I want to kind of go with is I feel financial education or financial literacy is just tremendously important. And I'm always really, 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 really concerned about friends or family or strangers out there. I deeply care about just people not getting misinformed. And you even brought up too, I love it, but this is where I was going to next. How do we know the difference in the financial world when we're trying to learn now about maybe investing, the difference between a salesman and a fiduciary?
Well, that's always a challenge because even in our little world that I'm still involved in the metals and mining industry, there's a few household names and people throw them around. And if they only knew their actual performance,
Mhm.
you would have a much different opinion. But they've built a facade that has created an aura of that they really know what they're talking about and so forth and so on. Uh, I think, like anything else, I certainly believe that people err in this result in this way. Facing a medical or legal challenge, we probably wouldn't just open up. We used to say the yellow pages, but now go to just do a search for a local attorney or doctor and just go with it. We would try to find people who have experienced that person or prove out their qualifications to demonstrate that they were well, but they don't do the same thing when it comes to financial advice. And in an industry where study after study shows that 80% of all money managers underperform simply putting your money in an index fund,
Mm.
you would think people would do more homework because you wouldn't go with 80% of doctors that underperformed other doctors. You would try to find the 20% that overperform. So I think that there you have to do more than just read the ads, so to speak, or the assumption. But a lot of times, judgment we're given most people are given a intuition of some level. That just it's a lot of times feeling. Problem is, they get caught up when the people are aggressive and make it sound too good to be true. Uh, I'm very concerned about the level of financial service because so much of the time spent once you get a license is how to be a better salesperson and through how to sell better than to keep learning about the different aspects. And if I may, if you don't mind, I'll give you an example of this. And it's a pet peeve of mine. So that's my charge to you for doing this interview. So I came several months ago. In fact, it was one of the main reasons why I owned gold a few years ago. I came convinced for myself
Mhm.
that the world was going to be more divided, trading, be less people interested in the United States, and therefore this thing called the BRICS, which stands for a group of countries that have formed together to trade and trade away from the United States, et cetera. But it's BRICS. So a little less than a year ago, I was called in to speak to a young financial advisory group here on the Jersey Shore. And I don't think anybody in the room was over 40. And yet they were all licensed financial advisors, or most of them was, maybe some sales assistants there or something. And I sat at a table with them, and the MC is going through the current speaker, but not noting it's me. And so when he says one of the things he's going to speak to us is about the BRICS, and the one financial advisor turned to the next one next to me, says, "Wow, he's going to talk about the housing industry." And it was just to not know what he really meant, and yet you're out there something that you really should know something about was just an example, and we can give many, many more of that. And here's another example, and this will get young people mad at me, but I'll tell you this: I know a lot more after 40 years than I did in those first 3, 5, or 10 years. In
Mhm.
fact, half the licensed financial advisors in the United States now weren't even born when I started practicing. Now, just because I have experience doesn't mean I'm successful, but experience is important in just about anything. Even in sports, you could be a super athlete, but you weren't the superest of athlete at first. You learned, you practiced, you got better, you got better, and then the God-given talent came through, and you're able to do that. So I think it's very, very important to know somebody more than the marketing materials, and quite frankly, uh, some of the best things you can get is references. If you've been blessed to know somebody, you trust them, and they say, listen, you should at least sit with this person. I've done well. But you normally know. In fact, funny thing, when you ask the people that have been scammed, and there is a lot of scamming in a lot of different ways, none of them ever, almost none of them ever say, oh, I believed it all the way. They had little things that they were concerned about, but that big picture, that number that they planted overwhelmed everything else. And that's another given. Listen, if the banks are paying one thing, just always say to yourself, at best, multiply it by two. And no matter what they're selling, if it's offering a return more than two times what a bank is paying me, there's some real risk in this. It may work, but it's not riskless. Yet it may be sold as it's almost riskless. It's amazing after all these years how many people still fall for the typical foreign currency scam. Somebody says they can make 10 or 20% a month trading foreign currencies and all sorts of. And so when when it's not when it's not really undersold and it seems to be oversold, you really need to have light bulbs going off and concerns about it. And this isn't just your lucky day that that person came along to meet you. You need to be very, very diligent. And again, in this society we live in now, is everything is fast paced. People aren't willing to take the time. And quite frankly, and this is a line I use, there are no boats. The old saying, oh, you better get on, the ship is going to sail without you. There's only ferries. If this one particular thing doesn't work out and the person says, if you don't get in, you're missing the boat, there'll be another boat, because they're all ferries. One will sail, but another one will come in. And you need to be patient. But like I said, we're in a very fast paced, get rich quick society now, because again, because it's come so challenging to live. But you will have more of a challenge than I had because of the way we were. We didn't have $36 trillion in national debt when I was your age. We didn't have uh, two-thirds of Americans just working paycheck to paycheck. Do you know that the 10% wealthiest people in America now own 86% of the assets? From 10% down to 50%, they own the remaining 14%, and half Americans have no assets. So it's a lot harder than buy low and sell high, even though that's what it looks like when you hear the pitches or watch the commercials.
Totally agree with you, Peter. And I like the fact too, especially because we were talking about, okay, when we're making the move to educate or learn about the space or trust someone else to manage our funds. I love that it all came down to, if you think about it fundamentally, to risk, right? Like the risk of, again, if we don't educate or if we follow the trend or if we look for the quick gains, right, we could get hurt, right? And now we just destroyed like that our wealth. Something that I want to maybe lead to, though, from here, you started bringing some of the concerns right now about how it's very challenging times right now. And I'm not looking to use fear to scare people here. I'm looking to be just real, honest, truthful. What are some like fears that you see right now when it comes to the world right now in terms of like financially right now for people, like the challenges that the everyday person's going through?
Well, it's just like I just said to you. Uh, and Canada mirrors it here in the US, and that is for the average person now is more challenging to make ends meet, so to speak.
Mhm.
Uh, Remember now, both our countries, but ours in particular, extremely indebted uh, to the point of there is great concern that if it continues to mount these deficits, we will even have trouble paying the interest on our debt. But I think even more so than that is, I think that it is becoming very unaffordable to do a lot of things that we took for granted when I was your age. For instance, the American dream, household ownership,
Mhm.
white picket fence, couple of kids, little dog. I go off to work, the wife says goodbye, raises the kid. That doesn't really even exist anymore because it's taken both the people working and trying to raise a family in order to get something more than meet ends meet. But I think the other undertone to all of this, and kind of where my wife and I have moved to in our personal lives, and that is the amount of people now that are struggling just to put food on the table, literally,
Mhm.
to where food banks throughout North America, Canada, and the US are seeing anywhere from 500 to 1,000% to many thousand% increase in people showing up, with many of those people now working class people, not just people that fallen on hard times or whatever, but in order to get by. And I think you walk now in any major city, Montreal, Toronto, you don't have to go far and see people that are literally
Mhm.
and off the street. And then of course costs, things that cost so much more now. The rents for people, if you want to even live and work in a major city, what it's becoming all. And then again, I think also that we're not getting the straight dope. Canada, particularly. Now, I'm not here to discuss your politics. Minds are messed enough here in
Mhm.
the US. But even now, with a country where it gets very limited mainstream media, it's basically one sided. It's hard to. I think young people are recognizing that and no longer turning to the regular mediums for news. That's they're seeking places they feel where they're getting more less filtered or being shown both sides of the story now. And so I think we what our parents and grandparents were used to really don't work anymore. I give you, if you don't mind, this is a great example. Let's look at just the stock market itself versus when I started. So in 1984, 87% of the trading of the stock market was by individual investors, and they were just buying and selling part ownerships of businesses. That was the concept of originally what the stock market was created for. And only 13% was institutional. There was no computer trading because there was no computers basically doing any type of trading. Now, over half the money that's in the stock market today here in the US is in what they call passive funds. These are funds that are not actively managed. They are institutionally managed, where there's a he or she financial institutional person managing it, but they're basically just trying to track an index or an indice. And the most popular one is the S&P 500 index. So when that manager receives money, it's his or her job to distribute it among the stocks that make up the S&P 500. So if the index goes up so much, so will this fund go up and all. But they don't have any individual discretion to change that, hold back, and so forth. And the same will happen when eventually selling comes. They won't be able to say, well, no, I don't want to sell this stock. It's too good, et cetera, et cetera. That other half, Ben, that exists, two-thirds of that's in computer type trading now, algorithm trading, where a computer is making decisions. Could be as simple as words in a news story or a very complicated program when certain futures and options and things are at certain prices and it trades in a nanosecond, so to speak. The smallest part of trading now is what the biggest part was just 40 years ago. And why I bring that up is because when I meet people like me, gray hair or no hair, you can't treat the market the same way as it used to be. Here's another reason why. Most people don't know this, and I'd be shocked if a lot of people in Canada know it at the moment. But financial institutions have created what has been called black pools. They are now trading among themselves without ever going through an exchange. And by the way, the exchange you may still see here down in the US, because the financial network has people there, it might as well be a museum. Most of it doesn't trade on the New York Stock Exchange anymore. It trades on these different exchanges, many of them across the river here in New Jersey. But now institutions are trading large blocks without ever going through an exchange. So I meet people say, yeah, I'm sitting home, I'm trading the market, I think I can beat it and so forth. And I say, well, you're not seeing everything you need to see. The bigger players are able to do something without you even knowing. So one of the things that I stress to people, the stock market isn't what it was 30 or 40 years ago. It's a completely different species. Obviously, it's far more high tech. And quite frankly, there are certain people that just clearly have more advantages than I would have had, where it was more of a fairer playing ground 40 years ago. Yet people don't want to talk about that because if the public ever recognized that and all, they may not be as open to what their current financial people are doing, knowing what I just described is the case.
Right. Well, I appreciate, hearing both of those stories and pieces of information. I also feel too like, even though this is an example of, things that are going on, I want to kind of pinpoint in terms of if we go now the opposite way, okay, it's hard times. I actually believe like hard times can make us grow, learn, and find a way to get through it together. And I don't think it's alone. Like there's a reason why I said together, me learning from you right now is also doing like the ripple effect, passing on to my friends, my family, and my communities. And so something that I'm alluding to is how do we, whether it's easy times or challenging times, how do we find ways to build generational wealth? What would you advise?
Well, it all starts at home. You got to spend less than you make. If you're not doing that, in the end, there isn't really much help you can help your friends for because it'll lead to much bigger troubles down there. I think there's another lesson that I learned the hard way that hopefully, if people recognize it, they don't have to go through what I went through. It's not how much you're going to make; it's how much you don't lose, which is going to separate you from the winners from the losers. So I think you err on the side of caution to begin with, and when things seem to be more challenging, when you're seeing that, well, half of Americans have no assets. They're not bad people. They were a lot of them are hardworking, wanted to do, but why didn't they end up with the assets? So a lot of things come across that and cause that. But one of the biggest things is that what we started at the beginning of this conversation is that money isn't the answer to everything. Because if you don't have your health, it's not going to matter how much wealth you have at all. If I may, and I don't know if we're running out of time, but I love to tell this is probably my three favorite stories in 40 years, Ben, if you don't mind me telling it.
Yeah, I would love to hear it.
So I had one of the wealthiest people in America as a client years ago when I was a money manager. Uh, he owned a house, him and his brother owned a household business that everybody knew. They were one of the first people when leverage buyouts came out. They were taken out for a couple of $1 billion. That company that took them out brought their company public again, ran it into bankruptcy. They brought it back out of bankruptcy and sold it again. So they made billions, two brothers. And I worked for one of the brothers. And we were around a lot when I was involved in the business. We did a lot of things outside of the business. And then we kind of lost contact. And then when I went through that big loss of money in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, I got an invite to him to come to his youngest daughter's wedding. And his youngest daughter wedding took place in what we call the Hamptons. And if you've seen the original Wall Street movie where Michael Douglas, who's playing Gordon Gekko's walking in early morning on the beach, one of those houses in the back is actually where this wedding reception is taking place. So here we are, my wife and I driving out. And at that point, I got rid of the Lincoln or whatever I had, and I was driving a Chevy or something. And when we pulled into the place, because what we looked like, because we were driving, everybody else was showing up in a Rolls Royce or a chauffeur driven thing. The guy said, the help park's over here. And he couldn't believe when I said, no, I'm a guest. And we sat in this room. The marriage had already occurred. The reception is on now. And we sat at a table with, I turned to Mary. I said, Mary, other than the help here, we're the poorest people in this room. This is not our, it never was my group. I was always a blue collar guy in a white collar room. Anyway, about an hour there, and I can't wait to go see him and go home. Some guy taps me on the shoulder and says, Carl, I'll say his first name, wants to see you. And I went up to, I don't know, one of the 10 bedrooms they had. And in the middle of the room, there he is, and he's weeping. Oh, Peter, I'm so glad I got it. What's wrong? And within a minute or two, I think he's dying. He's about to tell me he's got cancer or something. Is that at? And he starts to tell me that I'm the luckiest guy in the world. Now I know him to be at least a billionaire, if not a multi-billionaire at this point. And I know what my situation is. And he says, you're so great. And you got Mary and Tara. My daughter was a little girl at the time. He knew and all that. I said, Carl, what's wrong? He says, Pete, you don't understand. My youngest daughter got married. I don't know her favorite color. I don't know the name of her friend. I don't know nothing about her because I lived and he ran around, he did a lot of things. And now she's gone. What I give to be in your shoes. And I remember respectfully joking around, let's switch now. Mary's here. I'll ship Tara over. You send the billion to me. I said some typical Peter joke. And he laughed a little and he cried and we talked a little. And at that moment, probably within days, he went back to his old self. But at that moment, I think he'd be willing to have done that. And that was my clearest example that all the money in the world, because he had all the money in the world that anybody would need. And yet his life was totally unfulfilled at that moment because I had something which I didn't view as wealth, but it was priceless to him. And so I think one of the things we need to understand is this wealth that you talk about and generation and all is far bigger than just the money. It's all the other things that come really before it. And then if you're blessed, there's a scripture that there's a lot of debate by theologians what it means. And it's where basically says, Jesus said it's easier for a rich man for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven. And he was asked, does that basically mean if you're rich, you can't get in? No, but it's clearly a bigger challenge because as you have more money, we tend to move away from what people with little or no means stay focused on. And that's, I think, is the biggest teaching that if you do get the blessing, but you need to get everything else in order. What you're talking about is where they may make the mistake is they'll start focusing just on money. They got to learn about gold, and all those other things fall by the wayside. And even if they get lucky enough and catch something, one of those other issues grew too big, and now whatever money they made goes to fix that and all. Remember, half of all marriages end in divorce, and the overwhelming reason for divorce is matters of finance.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And I also think too, just something to add to what you just said at the end there, it all comes down, I think, actually to principles because principles aren't always sexy, right? It's like, okay, patience or, values of family or community. But I really feel when I think about like, let's say as an investor, so when we're talking about like finance and in terms of within wealth, I have a lot of principles that I follow and rules, and that really helps me stay in line and in check with myself. And it makes me better understand myself. So in that domain of financial wealth, it makes me, be able to apply those principles and rules, to make better decisions. And so maybe one last thing I just want to end off or ask you, Peter, before we kind of sign off here is what are principles that you've developed in your toolkit, to help make you make better decisions?
Well, the first one at the top that I use quite often, people think it's just sarcasm, but it's a lot more than that. It's better to be a live chicken than a dead duck. Error on the side of caution. Old sayings, half a loaf is better than none. There's just common sense principles that seem to be more ingrained in previous generations.
Mhm.
Uh, you don't have to be religious to apply what I'm about to say, but I think you have to have strong moral principles.
Mhm.
I think you have to recognize, do unto others as you want to be done to yourself. All those things that we might have taken for granted, but those are things that, if not done, uh, lead to things that end up being misgivings and all. Somebody once, I forget what the number was, but somebody once talked about people imprisoned. What a large percentage of them were not regular criminals that just committed crime, but made one big mistake. But then that big mistake forever changed their life and all. So I think it's common sense. And sometimes it looks like common sense is lost in the world that we live in because we tend to look at the internet, and the internet is a place of sensationalism. So they'll show us a video of this horrible thing that happened in this town, and we think that's what's happening in every other town because we're seeing it, or we see two or three, and then we make the assumption that's got to be happening everywhere. But use common sense. The vast majority of humans are not viciously evil, bad. Uh, but because we've been led to believe that a certain group, if they act or look, or if they wear a hat that says something, whatever they are, we make the assumption. And it's the old story about when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. And I think that's another critical factor.
I appreciate that. And it also goes with, you can also look at that as emotional intelligence as well, right? Like we're so judgmental as people
Absolutely.
to kind of judge, which is very, very, very silly. But also to manage our emotions properly so they're in check, so we make better decisions. So, Peter, I just want to take this last little bit of time. First off, I want to say again, like, appreciate you for being here. Appreciate you for making the time to speak your truth, to be vulnerable too, in terms of sharing about the good, the bad, the ugly. And then most importantly, something that I want to share with you, which I'm excited to share, is I really enjoyed seeing your podcast journey as well, right? So also developing your own channel, making it special. And I'm a religious follower where I watch a lot of your interviews, especially the one with Michael Gentile. I always look forward, or I even sent you an email, a couple weeks back. Hey, when is the next one? But no, I appreciate even beyond Michael, just a lot of the guests that you choose to be selective to affiliate your time with. And yeah, is there anything else before we sign off that you want to add to today's conversation?
I would just say that whatever you end up deciding how this earth was made, either through a great creator, a bunch of atoms exploding, or something we don't know.
Mhm.
Understand whatever led to its creation, it was mostly good things put on it. And I think we should all take a responsibility that to treat those good things as a gift. A lot of us assume there's always going to be clean water, there's always going to be food, the air is always going to be being. And it all starts with us. We can't keep saying they, whoever they is. It
Yeah,
has to start with me, us. And I think if we start to do that and ingrain it back into future generations, uh, we're good. The internet has been great for some things, but it's been absolutely atrocious for others. I, I tell you this, we all have one of these things, and now we're able to just say something. And it gives us all the answers. But I think part of life is learning the answers on your own and getting the experience that it teaches, and that we can send a sentence through a text and eight people can interpret it eight different ways. But if you actually hear me say it and see it, many times you'll all come to the same conclusion. So I think we need to go back to being more human and less machine driven.
I agree, Peter. And I think just before we kind of close, I would say being human is like the biggest thing that anyone could ever do, choosing love over fear. And that means being less judgmental, like it's funny, like every time I've seen, let's say a tweet or something that you put out where you kind of said, these trolls or people are kind of making, critical remarks about you. Have they ever tried, having a podcast or truly speaking like their thoughts and their feelings and their emotions? Probably not. So it's really, really, really easy to judge others when we haven't even done it ourselves. So it's also important. I think what I'm trying to close out there is anyone else that's tuning in, that's maybe creating content like yourself or even like me, expect critical feedback to come and don't always take it personal because not all of it is valid.
Well, I'm not the one to name them, but I use the name keyboard warriors. Without the keyboard and the safety, they won't. I've given them many opportunities to come and have a conversation that the public can see. I've been at shows where I've offered the audience, if you have a disagreement, speak. They don't. And then 3 days later, somebody who was at the show is making the same accusation that they had a chance to give you publicly. But someone once said to me, if you're not getting criticism, you can't be doing that good of a job. So sometimes you need to look at the criticism. But what I learned, especially most recently, with the worst attack that I've ever had, when I shared that to the audience, the amount of people that took the time to respond and share what they really thought that another otherwise wouldn't made it clear and evident to me, never let someone like that change you because so many other people think the other way. And so you're right. And but no one is ever going to agree with everybody else, but you need to be open minded. And even sometimes I need to be reminded of that, even though I've been doing this for so long. So I thank you. And I do want to say this for your audience. And the only reason why I'm doing this is I'm really happy to see someone like you wanting to do what they're doing. See, years ago, someone helped me a lot. And they said to me, if you ever get in the position, how you pay me back is pay it forward. And that's what I feel like I'm doing here one day. And hopefully one day because I think you got a lot of places to go there, young man. And Peter's gone. You just go and the next young person knocks on your door that maybe you didn't think you had time for and all. You make the time for them. And the world would be a better place if we all did that.
No, I appreciate those kind of words, Peter. And I think I can just guarantee this. It'd be a dishonor for me not to give back. I think I will continue to do that. And also feel, even though I'm a young buck, I also feel I'm currently doing it, through the fitness world. I'm giving back to community for free just out of pure desire to want to give back to people. And I will continue. I think it's a value of mine to give back to others and again, give that ripple effect. So I just want to conclude again, Peter, thank you for being here. And it was a pleasure catching up with you.
Thank you, my friend. God bless you.